When we start learning about histology, it's really important to know that someone looked down a microscope, and when they looked down that microscope, they saw something. They saw a tissue. And they usually were very descriptive, so they would call it the way they saw it. So histology is the study of tissues. Now, what's a tissue, you may ask? A tissue is a group of cells and the products that they make, or products that are outside of them. And we'll call that the matrix. When I'm looking at a tissue, I'm really considering the cells that are within it. And this is one of the things that's going to really differentiate different types of tissue and the matrix. Now let's remind ourselves the matrix is the material outside the cell. And this is really how we determine what type of tissue you are, what type of cells are inside that tissue, and also what does the matrix look like. As we start to look at the tissues, we're going to see that there are four major groups. The first are the epithelial tissues. The next major group is muscle. Then we have connective, and the last major group is the nervous tissue. So now let's spend some time and look at each one of those groups, and let's look at some of the major types of tissues under those headings. So let's go over to epithelial. Now, let's talk about where is epithelium. Epithelial tissue we find on the outside of the body. Great example would be your skin. It also tends to line cavities and pipes, tubes that run through the body. So as I look at epithelial, the key features of epithelium is that it is also almost all cells with very little matrix. And keep that in your mind. So if I'm looking at down a microscope and I see it's all cells, I really don't see any material outside. The cells are sort of shoulder to shoulder with each other. That's our first big clue that we're looking at epithelial tissue. And as I said earlier, epithelial tissue is found either facing the outside world, such as your skin, or facing within spaces, like hollow organs, pipes. When I say pipes, I mean tubes that run through your body. When we're looking at epithelium, we can also subdivide it into the covering and the lining type of epithelia. And a great example is skin. The second group would be the glandular epithelium, and this would be things such as the salivary glands. Now, let's start to look at the subtypes. So, when I look at epithelial, it has really 5 distinguishing characteristics. And this is going to be my checklist when I'm doing histology. And if I keep this in my mind, I can look down the microscope and I can go, yes, this seems to match these criteria. First of all, it has a polarity. It has one side that looks slightly different than the other side. Also, specialized contacts between the cells or the tissue underneath. Now, almost all the time when we're dealing with epithelial tissue, we'll have connective tissue below it. And that's a big clue that we're looking at epithelium. The next thing is it's avascular. So what do I mean by avascular? Well, as soon as I put the letter A in front of a word, it means without. So this tissue lacks blood vessels, and that's because it's all cells and no matrix. So there's really no space for blood vessels to go through it. Now, it is innervated, so it can have some nerve innervation. Now, the other thing is it really has potential to regenerate when damaged. So those are some of the things that we should keep in our mind as we're starting to look at the different types. Now, let's head over and start to look at some of the classification. Now, the main thing to think about when we're thinking about how are we going to classify epithelial tissue is we're going to give it a name. Now, epithelial tissue tends to have a first name and a last name. One of the names is going to describe the shape of the cell. The other one's going to tell us how many layers of cells do we have. Is it just one layer, or is it more than one layer of cells that are in this particular tissue? So let's have a look at some examples. Let's look at the shape. And here I've drawn out some shapes. And the names we're going to use for shapes are squamous, and you can see that that is very flat, almost kind of like a pizza look, very flattened. Cuboidal, well, because it's kind of like the shape of a cube. It's not always exactly, same height and same width, but pretty close to it. So that's going to be cuboidal. And the next one, if the cell tends to be taller than it is wider, I'm going to call it columnar. So those are three names that we're going to start to use for epithelial tissue. The next name will be how many layers. We have simple. Simple means it's one layer. So you see that those pink cells that I drew there, they're sitting on what we call a basement membrane. And typically, as I said before, underneath there would be connective tissue. So simple means one layer. Whereas if there's multiple layers with one layer on top of another, etc., as long as it's more than one layer, it could just be two or many more layers, then that is going to be stratified. So let's just review quickly. What names am I going to use when I'm naming epithelial? I will either refer to it as simple or stratified, and that would be the first name. The second name is going to describe the shape of the cell. Is it squamous, cuboidal, or columnar? Now let's have a look at some examples. So let's start with the simple ones. And here we go. This is simple squamous. Now what we're going to be having a look at here is simple squamous. Now remember, when I say simple squamous, I'm telling myself I have a cheat sheet here. Simple means one layer and the cells are going to be flat. And that's what we're seeing right here. That's one cell layer of cells and they're flattened in shape. And the blue we see under here would be something called a basement membrane, because epithelial tissue typically has a basement membrane underneath it. Now let's start to look at some examples. Now this is, you won't recognize this most likely, this is a glomerulus. It's part of a kidney. But what we're going to look at is right here, this layer that I'm just highlighting. Now if you look carefully within this layer, you can see that we have individual flattened cells within there, and I'm just going to highlight a bunch of them. So that is simple squamous epithelium. Now let's move to the next type, and this would be simple cuboidal. Now stop for a second and ask yourself the question, why am I calling this simply cuboidal? And of course the answer is, it's one cell layer thick and the cells are shaped like cubes. Now let's have a look at a simple cuboidal. Now let's remind ourselves, what layer are we looking at? It is this layer that I'm highlighting right now in yellow. And if we look carefully, we can see there are individual cells that really look very cube-like. So this is a simple cuboidal. Just in case you're interested, what is this material underneath here? That is a connective tissue, because recall that when I'm dealing with epithelium, underneath I'm going to have a connective tissue. The third one would be a simple columnar, and as we can see here, it is one layer thick and the cells are column shaped. And once again, it's resting on a basement membrane. This is a layer that we're interested in right here. And if we look, we can see there are individual cells that are column shaped throughout here. And so it's simple columnar. Now, since we're here, I want to point out one little thing that you may be noticing. You notice that these cells right here, you see them, they're spread throughout here. These are a different type of cell called goblet cells. Don't you love the name? Because someone looked down the microscope and they called it like they saw it. It looked like a wine goblet to someone. Does it? I'll leave it up to you to decide. And these actually make mucus, and they're a really great cell, but I'm not going to spend much time talking about them. So now that we've seen our simples, we have our simple squamous, our simple cuboidal, and our simple columnar. Now let's go to the next group. Well, actually, before we go to the next group, I want to stop at this one group that is a bit different, because I said earlier we have simple and stratified, but there's one tissue that is called pseudo-stratified columnar. Pseudo-stratified columnar. That's this one right here. Now look at the name. Pseudo means false. And let's have a look at it. Now here in pseudo-stratified, if I look, here's a cell. Okay. Now if I look carefully, I can see that there's different nuclei here. These are the cells for different, or I should say these are the nuclei for different cells within this tissue. And at first glance, it may look that there are multiple layers. But if we look very carefully, what we'll see is all of these cells touch the basement membrane. And let's zoom in so we can really see that. So no matter what, all the cells are touching the basement membrane. And all these are the cells that are part of the pseudostratified. And it's not stratified. It looks like it, so it's pseudo-stratified. All right, now let's go to the real stratified. Now, here we run into a little issue, because when I look at stratified squamous, I'm looking at a number of cells in different layers. Right? Now, if you look carefully, you notice that the cells, I'm going to write A here and B there. The cells up near A, at that outer layer, are flat, so I'd call them squamous. The ones at the bottom look cuboidal. So what am I going to call this? How do I need some type of convention that says, hey, where am I going to look at the cell to determine its shape? And in this case, I'm going to look at the cells that are on the outer surface. And that outer surface I am going to call apical. And that's the apical surface. That's why I wrote A there. And here's the basilar surface, the basal surface. And that is down there. So whenever I'm trying to name a stratified squamous, remember because it's multi-layers, I am going to look at the cells that are in the apical. And in this case, you can see that they are more of a squamous. So a stratified squamous. Right? Let's move over and once again remind ourselves, apical means the top layer. Basilar means the bottom layer of cells. All right, now let's head over here and let's start to have a look at some of the diagrams. And these are actual photographs of histology. Now, what are we looking at? Down here is connective tissue. All this more pinky stuff is connective tissue. We're really looking at, let me zoom in, we're really looking at this. That is the thickness of the tissue. Okay? And of course, right underneath here, because this is where the epithelium and the connective tissue connect, that would be my basement membrane running there. Now, you can start to see that this has a number of cells. So as I move from the basilar to the apical surface, there's a number of cells. So definitely it is stratified. Now, what am I going to call it? I'm not going to name it after the cells down here in the basilar region, which are more cuboidal. I'm going to go up here. Now, you're looking up here and going, that just looks like a mess. It just almost looks like shattered glass or torn fabric. Why does it look like this? This is the skin. This is your skin, the outer layer of your skin, your epidermis. And the cells out here on the apical surface are actually dead. So if I was to look at the cells, they would be very flat. They're flattened. They've lost all their organelles. They're full of a protein called keratin, and they're flat. And that's why this tissue will be known as a stratified squamous. Now let's head down here to a stratified cuboidal, and we'll follow our general guidelines again. So stratified cuboidal tells me many layers, and it's cube-like. So there we go. We have multiple layers. Now remember, I always look at my apical surface versus my basilar surface to tell me how I'm going to name it. And let's have a look. So as I said, this is a stratified cuboidal. And we can see it is. We have different cell layers here. And you can see the outer cell layer, the apical cell layer, is a cuboid in shape. Now, let's go to one of the last ones that we're going to look at with epithelium. And this is a stratified columnar. Now, this is actually rare. You don't see this too often. And, look at some of the criteria. It's rare. It's column-shaped. This is where I see secretion and protection. It's often found between simple epithelia and stratified squamous epithelium. That's where it is. It's often near salivary glands, places like the vas deferens, if you happen to know what those are. If not, don't worry about it. That's associated with the male reproductive tract. Intestinal linings, also, you can see some of this material there. And once again, you can see if we follow the general rule, we do have 2 cell layers, and so it's stratified and it is columnar. So that's an overview of the major types of epithelium. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to break this video into a few chunks. So this video was the introduction to what is tissue and a look at the major groups that we have, like epithelium, muscle, connective tissue, nervous, and then we did a deeper dive into what is epithelial and some examples of it. Now, remember, one of the most important things when you're doing histology is get into your brain a checklist of what a tissue should look like. And let's just quickly review. So if I'm looking at epithelium, remember, it's all cells, no visible matrix. Is there matrix? There can be a little bit, but no visible matrix. And then I name it based on 2 characteristics. Let's start with the first characteristic. First characteristic is how many layers. If it's 1 layer of cells, simple. More than 1 layer, stratified. And then we look at the apical surface. And if the apical surface is flat, it's squamous. If it's the shape of a cube, it's cuboidal. And if it's the shape of a column, I'm going to call it columnar. All right, I'm going to end this one here, and I will then start a new video on muscle, the different types of muscle tissues. So if you haven't had a chance, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, drop any comments. If you have any want an explanation of anything else around histology, drop it in the comments section and I'll try and get back to you. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.